We're joined now by Dorothy Allen. Hello, Dorothy.
Hello, lovely to be here.
And Lord Alf Dubs.
Hello, good to meet you.
You're here because there's an event at the ICC on the 24th of November called Seeking Refuge. You're invigilating that, Dorothy. Can you tell us a little bit about the event?
Yes, I'd be very, very happy to. It's an event we're looking forward to very much. It's a special event about migration, which obviously has a huge resonance for all of us here in the Irish Cultural Centre, had it not been for the fact that Ireland is an emigrant nation, we wouldn't exist here. So what's happening on Friday, the 24th of November, is we have a panel of 3 eminent people. We have, as you already mentioned, Alf Dubs, whose lifelong campaigns have been justice for migrants, asylum seekers and refugees. We will also have with us Sally Hayden. Sally is an Irish journalist who has worked a great deal in Africa, and she has written an absolutely remarkable book called My Fourth Time We Drowned. The reference is a message that was sent to her from a migrant who was trying to get from Africa to Europe. And her book is about the most dangerous migration route in the world, which is the route across the Southern Med. She will read from her book and she will talk about what provoked her to write it. Joining her will be Malatu Uche Okore. Malatu is Irish-Nigerian. She moved to Ireland about 8 or 10 years ago from Nigeria with a small child. And she lived in government-designated hostel for refugees. And she has written about her experience. She's a wonderful fiction writer. She has written a book of short stories called The Hostel Life. And she will read from her book, and she will also talk to us about her experiences, which were not always entirely happy as a refugee, as a black refugee, an African refugee in Dublin.
Fantastic. That's on the 24th of November. Alf, normally at this point in the show, I'd ask you to tell us a little bit about yourself, but you gave a marvellous talk in the US Embassy in the days of Obama. And if I may, I'll play that.
I was born in Prague. My father was Jewish, my mother wasn't. And when the Nazis occupied Prague in March 1939, my father disappeared immediately. He told his cousin he was going. Cousin said no, and they went off to Auschwitz in 1941. So my mother tried to get permission to leave and was refused. So she put me on a kinder transport. I remember, I can still see in my mind's eye the departure from Prague station with my mother looking anxious, German soldiers with swastikas, and the journey was interminably long. But I remember when we got about nearly 24 hours later, we got to the Dutch border, and then the older ones cheered because we were outside of the reach of the Germans. And I arrived in London. I was very lucky because I had somebody waiting for me who was a parent, as opposed to some of them who only had foster parents awaiting them. No, I think I was treated pretty well in this country. I think this country gave me tremendous opportunities, for which I'm enormously grateful. I was trying to understand what had happened, and I think I said to myself, if evil men can cause such terrible things to happen in politics, maybe politics can also be used the other way for the better of my fellow human beings. So I was passionately interested in politics at a time when my contemporaries just weren't, and I studied things and so on. So I suppose that set me on this path. Save the Children did a study of unaccompanied child refugees in Europe, and they came up with a lower figure of 26,000, which they then increased to a figure of 95,000. But as a result of what they did, there was a suggestion made that Britain should take 3,000 of these. So the amendment simply said Britain should take 3,000 unaccompanied child refugees from Europe. On its way to the Commons, it looked like the government were then going to lose. Enough Conservative MPs were going to support it. So Theresa May very charmingly said, could I have another chat with her? And she said she proposed to accept the amendment, and I had the pleasure of seeing her name on my amendment on the House of Commons order paper. I think what we've got to do is make sure the world is focused on our responsibilities to refugees, and that all countries should be part of this. And I hope President Obama will address his powerful influence on all countries, but particularly those that are doing very little or nothing at all. We've got to say that this is a humanitarian crisis, and we've got to step up to the mark with humanitarian solutions, and all of us should accept responsibility.
That's a really gripping story. And the one thing that strikes me straight away, you as someone who has made the journey yourself, is that you still sound fantastically optimistic, both in terms of how you were treated, but also in terms of being able to do something. Sometimes we look at the migration crisis and it just, a gloom descends.
I think one has to be optimistic. Because if not, one just gives up. You know, in that clip, and that clip was some time ago, the government actually didn't play straight by it, because when my amendment went through, they eventually cut the numbers back to 480, which was derisory. And they did that on the grounds that there weren't enough local authority foster families. Well, we disproved that. We found 1,500. But worse than that, two other things happened more recently. One is that one of the key things was to enable refugee children to join family. And there was under the EU, there was a Dublin Treaty which basically said, or part of it said, that a refugee child in one EU country can apply to join relatives, family, so on, in another. And in the 2017 Act of Parliament, I put in a clause which would ensure that Britain negotiated to continue that even after we left the EU. A disaster leaving the EU, but that's for another day. And that got through both houses. In 2019, the government took it out. Absolutely shabby. I had meetings with government ministers. They assured me everything would be all right. It wasn't, and the family reunion thing pretty well stopped. The last awful thing, and there were many others in between, was the most recent legislation, the Illegal Migration Act, under which the government said that anybody crossing the Channel will not be allowed to claim asylum. That's a total breach of the United Nations Geneva Convention. It's a total breach of our obligation to refugees. It's just invented from nowhere. And what's more, it'll be a criminal offence to bring people over. If people have no safe and legal way to come here, particularly if they have family here, then they will choose other methods. We all would. So that was a really miserable bit of legislation.
Do you think the government is actually representing the mood of the people in their hostile approach to migration?
I think it's a good question. I think there is a battle going on to win public support. At the beginning, in 2015, 2016, British public opinion woke up to what was happening when they saw photographs on our television of Alan Kurdi, a Syrian boy drowned on a Mediterranean beach. My belief is that when people know what it is these people have gone through, these asylum seekers, when they know the war, the threat of torture, the persecution, the awful things that have happened to them, they become immediately more sympathetic. When you have government ministers saying these people are invaders and they shouldn't be here, people become less sympathetic. And I think it behoves government ministers to speak and use different language. The language they're using is pernicious and divides our community. But I think the argument for public opinion is there. And if I could say, in many continental countries, the extreme right-wing parties have exploited the asylum situation for their cheap political ends by getting votes, by being opposed to asylum seekers. We've seen it in Germany, where Angela Merkel really lost out after taking 1 million Syrians. Good for her. We've seen it in Italy. We've seen it in Slovakia. We've seen it in Hungary. We've seen it in France. So there are real dangers, which is why public opinion is so important.
The people come up with all sorts of ways that they're going to try and improve the situation. Obviously, the root cause would be not to support so many wars that are going on so far away. We have stuff like climate change, which is also beginning to drive people off their land. Nearer home, you've got people who are on the beach welcoming refugees as they come in. Where can we begin as a society to find a solution to this issue?
That's a very difficult question. I think more could be done to prevent the root causes of people being obliged to flee from wars. After all, the great powers are battling in Syria, and we're not helping the Syrians. Afghanistan has proved to be a disaster. So there are a number of parts of the world where we in the West are also at fault. Having said that, it's going to be a pretty difficult task to reverse climate change. I hope we can. And we have to expect more movement of people. I think it's going to be inevitable. And the thing is, we have to do it in such a way that the public understand why we're doing it. And we have to do it in collaboration with other countries. That's to say, Britain can't deal with this on its own. For all the talk about asylum seekers, we are 17th out of 18 countries in Europe in terms of taking asylum seekers in relation to our population. So, there's a lot of talk about this, and there's a lot of attempt to increase anxiety by government ministers, and I think that's wrong. And what we have to do is to tell the story of what people have been through, the tragedies they've suffered. There was one Syrian boy who said to me on one occasion, he saw his father blown up in front of him by a bomb in Aleppo or Damascus. Now, how can anybody function for the rest of their lives when that's happened? And yet we have to be understanding of the terrible situation these people have been through and be sympathetic. And then we have to make sure that our local communities are welcoming. There are strategies for doing that, there are ways of doing that, but we have to make sure, I could tell you a few stories about that, we have to make sure we're welcoming, and that's why when government ministers poison the atmosphere, they have a lot to answer for.
There's a slight disconnect. At the moment, we're seeing bombing on our TV screens every night, and we can begin to get a visceral sense of the suffering. But then by the time that person has flown from that awful situation, crossed Europe, crossed half the world to get to this country, we no longer seem to offer that sympathy that we did when they were far away on the telly screen having their tower block bombed.
When government ministers, and I'm repeating myself a bit, when government ministers make a hostile comment about that people fleeing for safety are invaders, and invaders in most languages are the enemy. And when government ministers talk like that, they poison the atmosphere in local communities. And I found that on the whole, if we can get rid of the government ministers' poisonous comments, that local communities actually can be very supportive and sympathetic. All over the country, I've seen that. But the important thing is to encourage local communities in order to encourage local. We've got to encourage local communities to be supportive, and that means telling them exactly how it is and telling them what people have been through, and devising sensible strategies. For example, let me give you a nice story. Fulham and Chelsea football foundations had a joint event to train refugees in football. And that was sponsored by Guy Lineker, who did a great job. And we had all these kids learning about it. And I think that was phenomenal. The important thing is to give refugees, particularly children, the chance to be normal like other children, to behave normally, and to be given a chance to behave normally, and to do the things that other children do. And sport is one of the great ways of doing it.
When you were here as a young child or a teenager, did you feel welcome? Did you feel the same as the other kids?
I think they thought I was a bit odd. After all, English is my third language, so I had to learn English. And you learn. Mind you, at 6 years old, you learn fast because survival in a school playground depends upon your learning the language. However, I think they thought I was a bit odd because I still had quirky in different ways. But on the whole, it wasn't that unwelcoming. I had the feeling, mind you, my mother later on, my father long died, my mother later on, when she was trying to get a job to sustain herself and me, this was after the war, and she, to cut a long story short, she was turned down for a job, applied again, turned down again, and she heard somebody in the interview panel say, "We're not giving a job to that bloody foreigner." And she was absolutely distraught, and I wasn't old enough or mature enough to support her. I think now I would know what to do, a little bit. But I wasn't, and she went through absolute agonies, because she felt totally rejected and didn't know what she was going to do. She traipsed around looking for other jobs. Eventually she found one, but it was a difficult time for her. So yes, there were problems. I didn't feel them. I think it was more difficult for my mum.
Do you think we advertise enough the contribution that migration can bring? I mean, people talk about the economic, that we're all getting much older, that we're an older society, and that we need young people to keep the whole show on the road.
Well, I think our responsibility to asylum seekers, let's talk about them and I'll talk about migrants, to asylum seekers, our responsibility is to give them safety, to treat them as international conventions demand, to treat them as people who have the right to a decent life and to help them restore that life. Whether that's by enabling young people to get back into education, which to me, they always seem to say that's what they want, or older people to get jobs. At the moment, they're not allowed to work. Older people to get jobs. These are the important things that we should be able to do, to provide them with that sort of supportive environment. And I think that matters. Now, as far the majority of people coming to this country are not asylum seekers. They are migrants. And our job market needs people. In fact, we've suffered since Brexit because there are jobs that aren't being filled.
Not
and we
enough
relied
foreigners.
upon people to come and fill them. So I think every country, has an obligation to provide safety to asylum seekers. And can I say, I think Britain should do it along with other EU countries. I think Britain should do it because we need to cooperate. We can't just deal with this on our own. We should cooperate in terms of that. But as far as migration is concerned, we should have a sensible policy so that we can take people that our job market needs, consistent with their right to have a decent life here.
I think this is the perfect time to play Refugee Blues. Now, this is Sheila Hancock reading W H Auden's poem.
Say this city has 10 million souls. Some are living in mansions, some are living in holes. Yet there's no place for us, my dear. Yet there's no place for us. Once we had a country and we thought it fair. Look in the atlas and you'll find it there. We cannot go there now, my dear. We cannot go there now. In the village churchyard there grows an old yew. Every spring it blossoms anew. Old passports can't do that, my dear. Old passports can't do that. The consul banged the table and said, if you've got no passport, you're officially dead. But we are still alive, my dear, but we are still alive. Went to a committee. They offered me a chair, asked me politely to return next year. But where shall we go today, my dear? But where shall we go today? Came to a public meeting. The speaker got up and said, if we let them in, they will steal our daily bread. He was talking of you and me, my dear. He was talking of you and me. Thought I heard the thunder rumbling in the sky. It was Hitler over Europe saying they must die. We were in his mind, my dear, we were in his mind. Saw a poodle in a jacket fastened with a pin. Saw a door opened and a cat let in. But they weren't German Jews, my dear, but they weren't German Jews. Went down the harbour and stood upon the quay. Saw the fish swimming as if they were free. Only 10 feet away, my dear, only 10 feet away. Walked through a wood, saw the birds in the trees. They had no politicians and sang at their ease. They weren't the human race, my dear. They weren't the human race. Dreamed I saw a building with 1,000 floors, 1,000 windows and 1,000 doors. Not one of them was ours, my dear. Not one of them was ours. Stood on a great plain in the falling snow. 10,000 soldiers marched to and fro, looking for you and me, my dear, looking for you and me.
That was Sheila Hancock reading Refugee Blues. And we're here with Dorothy Allen and Alf Dubs, and we're talking about seeking refuge at the ICC on the 24th of November. Dorothy, the event features Alf, as well as two authors, one who's written as a journalist about migration and
Yes.
one who's written a more lyrical book from a personal point of view. We can use art, can't we, to explore these subjects and possibly begin to find solutions?
Yes, of course. And I think that Malatu Ute Okori, who is the Nigerian writer, uses art exquisitely because she is a very fine, delicate writer. You like her enormously as well, Roz.
I mean, I've read the book, This Hostile Life. It's women's voices, mainly in those short stories. They're quite magnificent and touching and deeply painful at times as well. But she's not only a great writer, but she's now teaching. She's leading writers' workshops in London at various art centres and teaching people to write. So there's an example of how a refugee, is passing on things and being a major contribution to our society. And she's an absolutely beautiful person.
And I think we also need to remember that the pain expressed in her art is very, very keenly felt because she felt it herself personally. It is the pain of people who are subject to racist abuse. It is the pain of people who are migrants or asylum seekers or refugees who are made to feel unwelcome. And as Alf has pointed out, and has pointed out many, many, many times, the narrative is to make enemies of those who need our help the most.
Alf, I imagine you'll be looking forward to meeting Malatu and almost comparing notes on your journeys.
Yeah.
50 or 60, 70 years apart.
Yes, I am looking forward to the day, and I'm looking forward to meeting her. Yes.
For the rest of the show, we're going to be looking at Irish travellers and the travelling community. I know that you have experience of that community yourself.
Well, I served as a junior minister when Mo Mowlam was Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, so I spent 3 years, virtually 3 years in Ireland, and I got involved, among other things, with the rights of travellers and the way in which they were disparaged and belittled, and their need to be decently treated in terms of housing, in terms of opportunities, in terms of sites and so on. So I was involved, and I very much welcome any attention that is drawn to that, because these are very vulnerable people who are victimized and who are abused and not treated equally, and they deserve to be treated better.
Yeah, I just want to say, Lord Dubs, I want to thank you for being a patron here at the ICC for so many years. You've made such a valuable contribution to this cultural centre, but also to the Irish community in London, and we really respect you, admire all the work that you're doing. We're very, very grateful to you.
Well, thank you. Look, it's a privilege to be involved, associated with the centre here. I think it's a great place, and congratulations on the many successes you're having.
Thank you. And by the way, weekly we have groups of refugees coming here to do classes. The local borough is doing a wonderful job, actually, in supporting refugees. So we're very conscious of it because they use the space regularly. So we've met lots of wonderful young people coming in. They're a pleasure to meet, really lovely.
That's great. Thank you very much, Lord Dubs.
Thank you.
Thank you.